When most people imagine ancient Rome, they think of marble temples, powerful emperors, and the roar of the Colosseum. Hollywood has filled our minds with visions of noble senators, mighty gladiators, and a city of grandeur where civilization flourished. But behind that polished image lay a brutal reality. For an ordinary traveler, even a Roman citizen, the empire was far from safe. In truth, you would be lucky to last 24 hours in Rome without falling victim to disease, violence, or corruption. The first shock would come the moment you stepped into the city itself. Rome was massive, home to more than 1 million people at its peak, making it the largest city in the ancient world. But it was not a clean or orderly place. Narrow streets overflowed with waste. Open sewers ran down the sides of roads. The stench of urine, rot, and burning refuse filled the air. Wealthy Romans had private baths and aqueduct-fed fountains, but the poor crowded into insula-cramped apartment blocks that often collapsed or went up in flames. If the filth didn't get you, the fire might. Disease was everywhere. Without proper sanitation, parasites and infections spread quickly. Water carried from aqueducts was not always safe, and food markets teemed with flies. Doctors existed, but medicine was primitive and often based on superstition. Simple cut could kill you through infection, and epidemics frequently swept through the city, wiping out thousands. Even if you managed to avoid sickness, the streets themselves were dangerous. Rome was a city of extremes, vast wealth and crushing poverty. Slaves made up nearly 1/3 of the population, and the tension between masters and the enslaved added to the volatility. At night, the city became a hunting ground. With little organized policing, crime flourished. Gangs roamed the alleys, robbing, stabbing, and sometimes killing anyone unfortunate enough to be caught alone. Foreign visitors in particular were easy prey, right? And survival was not only about health or crime. The social structure of Rome was designed to keep the powerful safe and everyone else in danger. Laws were harsh and punishments brutal. A wrong word to the wrong person could land you, in court or worse, in the arena. The average Roman citizen lived in constant awareness that life was fragile, and death could come from disease, violence, or even the whim of an emperor. This was the true face of Rome, a city of splendor and decay, of breathtaking monuments built on human suffering. To step into this world would not be to walk through history's shining empire. It would be to enter a place where survival was uncertain, and every hour could bring you closer to disaster. But this was only the beginning. If the city itself didn't claim you, Rome's entertainment, its infamous gladiatorial games, might. And for outsiders, being thrown into the arena was not just possible, it was terrifyingly common. If you thought the streets of Rome were dangerous, the Colosseum was worse. It wasn't just a monument of stone, it was a machine of death. It's built to seat over 50,000 screaming spectators. It symbolized the empire's power through blood and spectacle. And for the unlucky, it became the final stop on Earth. For visitors or enslaved people, the risk of ending up in the arena was real.
Ow.
Criminals, prisoners of war, and sometimes even ordinary citizens could be condemned to fight. The emperor and magistrates had nearly limitless power to sentence people, and once chosen, there was no escape. To step into the Colosseum was to enter a world where human lives were entertainment.
Ow.
The games began with animal hunts. Exotic beasts, lions, tigers, elephants, even crocodiles were brought from across the empire. Starving and enraged, they were unleashed on unarmed men, women, or slaves. Few lasted more than minutes. Their deaths fed the crowd as appetite for violence and reminded everyone watching that Rome ruled not only people, but nature itself. Then came the executions. Those accused of theft, rebellion, or desertion were sometimes tied to stakes and left for wild animals to tear apart. Others were forced to reenact myths, where the ending was always death. One man might be dressed as Icarus only to be burned alive. Another as Hercules, crushed beneath staged labors. These punishments blurred the line between justice and theater. But the true stars of the Colosseum were the gladiators. Contrary to popular belief, not all gladiators fought to the death. They were expensive investments, trained in special schools. Still, death was never far away. A wounded gladiator might beg for mercy, but the decision lay with the crowd and ultimately the emperor. A simple gesture of a thumb could mean life for a sword to the throat. Imagine sitting in the audience as a foreigner. The roar of the crowd would be deafening, the smell of blood thick in the air. For Romans, this was entertainment, a symbol of discipline and honor. For outsiders, it was a nightmare. The message was clear. Rome's power rested on blood, and your life meant nothing if you stood against it. The games also served a darker purpose. They distracted the masses from hunger, poverty, and political unrest. Bred in circuses, as the saying went, keep the people fed and entertained, and they won't revolt. But behind that slogan was a truth. The empire's survival depended on turning death into spectacle. For you, surviving Rome meant avoiding attention. One wrong word, one accusation, and you could find yourself beneath the shadow of the Colosseum, where thousands cheered for your suffering. And yet the arena was only one danger. Beyond its walls lay another world of horror, the Roman baths, places where disease and politics mixed in ways that could kill just as quickly. The Roman baths are often remembered as symbols of luxury grand halls with marble floors, flowing water, and heated pools where citizens gathered to relax. But the reality was far more sinister. If you stepped into one of these communal bathhouses, your survival clock might begin to tick even faster. Baths were crowded, with hundreds crammed into the same pools. There was no understanding of germs, no sense of hygiene beyond scraping oils from the skin with a strigil. Water was reused, rarely changed, and often filthy. Parasites thrived in the warm pools. Eye infections, skin diseases, and intestinal parasites spread rapidly. If you carried even the smallest wound, the water could infect it, and without antibiotics, that meant death. But disease wasn't your only danger. The baths were also political arenas. Senators, generals, and merchants met there to discuss deals or plot schemes. If you spoke out of turn or attracted the wrong attention, you might not leave the baths alive. Assassinations happened in steam rooms, daggers hidden beneath tunics. Very place built for relaxation doubled as a stage for betrayal. Then there was the culture of excess. Bathhouses weren't just for bathing, they were attached to gyms, libraries, and dining halls. After sweating in the hot rooms, many Romans feasted heavily, consuming spoiled meats, fish sauces, and cheap wine. Food poisoning was common. Without refrigeration, markets were filled with rotting goods, often masked by spices. Diarrhea and stomach infections killed countless people each year, striking rich and poor alike. For a foreigner, navigating Roman dining customs could also be dangerous. Refuse a dish or fail to show proper respect, and you might insult your host. Offending the wrong patron could mean social ruin or worse. Patron-client relationships ruled Roman society, and stepping outside the hierarchy was risky. Even the water itself posed a hidden threat. Rome's aqueducts were marvels of engineering, but many pipes were made of lead. Over time, historians argue lead poisoning spread through the population. While some scholars debate the extent, traces of lead have been found in Roman skeletons, suggesting long-term health damage that no one understood at the time. So imagine this. You leave the baths with a rash from infected water, your stomach churning from spoiled food, and whispers about you spreading because of a misstep in conversation. Your body weakens while your enemies grow stronger. Survival becomes less about strength and more about avoiding attention. But even if you escaped sickness, poison, and plots, there was another silent danger lurking on the streets of Rome: the justice system itself. Because in this empire, the law was not designed to protect you. It was designed to break you. If you thought Rome's courts could save you, you'd be gravely mistaken. The Roman justice system was not built on fairness, it was built on power. If you were poor, enslaved, or a foreigner, the odds were already stacked against you. Trials were public spectacles. Accusations could be made by rivals, neighbors, or political enemies, and evidence was often based on rumor or forced testimony. Torture was a common tool to extract confessions, especially from slaves. What mattered wasn't the truth, it was who had influence. Wealthy elites could buy outcomes. The powerless could only hope for mercy. The punishments were designed not only to punish but to terrify. Petty thieves could be flogged until their backs split open. Deserting soldiers were stoned or beaten to death by their own comrades. For more serious crimes, crucifixion was the ultimate penalty, slow, public death on wooden crosses that lined Rome's roads. The message was clear: defy Rome, and your agony becomes a warning to others. Execution by beasts, known as damnatio ab bestias, was another fate reserved for criminals, rebels, and prisoners of war. Thrown into the arena, the condemned faced lions, leopards, or bears, with no hope of survival. Sometimes they were tied to posts, sometimes given weapons too weak to defend themselves. Their deaths were entertainment, not justice. Even Roman citizens weren't always safe. Political rivals could be charged with treason or corruption, often leading to exile or forced suicide. Under certain emperors, paranoia reigned. A single word against the emperor could mean your entire household was executed. Roman law might look sophisticated on stone tablets, but in practice it was a weapon wielded by the powerful. For foreigners, the situation was even worse. Non-citizens had little protection under Roman law. Enslaved people were considered property, not humans, meaning their owners could torture or kill them with minimal consequence. A traveler accused of theft might be branded, whipped, or sold into slavery without a fair hearing. Even daily life was touched by fear of punishment. Debt could land you in chains. Failing to pay taxes might see your home confiscated. Rome's legal system wasn't a shield, it was a trap, ensuring that the weak remained under the boot of the strong. To survive in such a world, you had to keep your head down, avoid angering your betters, and pray you never drew the attention of the law. Because once you entered Rome's courts, your chances of survival plummeted. And yet, the courts were not the only silent killers. Beyond the shadow of legal terror, the very air and water of Rome carried threats, deadly diseases, and poisons that no one truly understood. If the violence of Roman justice didn't end you, something far quieter might. Rome itself was a city crawling with invisible killers. In an age without modern medicine, the simplest cut or infection could spiral into death. And in the packed, filthy neighborhoods of Rome, disease spread like wildfire. Public baths, for example, were not the relaxing sanctuaries we imagine. They were warm, moist breeding grounds for bacteria. Thousands of citizens shared the same pools, the same sponges, and the same steam rooms. Skin infections, parasites, and contagious fevers passed easily from one body to another. Many bathers left feeling refreshed only to collapse days later with burning fevers. Rome's water supply, so advanced for its aqueducts, was far from safe. Our pipes were often lined with lead, slowly poisoning those who drank from them daily. Symptoms like memory loss, seizures, and madness plagued the wealthy who consumed the most water and wine sweetened with lead powder. The poor suffered differently, often forced to drink from stagnant cisterns contaminated with human waste. Then there were the plagues. In the 2nd century, the Antonine Plague swept through the empire, killing perhaps 5 million people. Some historians believe it was smallpox, leaving survivors scarred for life. Later, the plague of Cyprian devastated entire towns, sparing no class or age. Death carts rolled through the streets filled with bodies. If you lived in Rome, epidemics were not a question of if, but when. Food was no safer. Without refrigeration, meat spoiled quickly, often crawling with worms by the time it was cooked. Grain stored in silos became infested with mold that produced toxic fungi. Even the wealthy, feasting on exotic delicacies, were not immune. Oysters, carried parasites, and sauces made from rotting fish caused food poisoning. And then, of course, there was deliberate poisoning. Romans had a long, dark tradition of slipping toxins into wine or meals, especially among the elite. Political rivals, unwanted husbands, or inconvenient heirs often met their end by cup rather than sword. Wealthy households even kept tasters to test food before the master dined, but this protection was not foolproof. Add to this the constant presence of vermin rats, lice flea-ained, Rome becomes a death trap. The streets and markets crawled with disease-carrying pests, and few people connected them to outbreaks. Yet, illness was often blamed on angry gods, curses, or bad air. Every breath, every bite, every sip carried a risk. And while the Romans accepted death as part of life for a newcomer, it would feel like living inside a slow-moving nightmare. But beyond these hidden killers lurked something even more terrifying: Rome's love of spectacle. Because sometimes death wasn't hidden in water or food. Sometimes it was staged for tens of thousands to watch, cheering for your final scream. If the streets of Rome could kill you quietly, the arenas promised something far louder, bloodier, and spectacular. The Colosseum, towering over the city with its marble and arches, was not just an architectural wonder, it was a machine of death designed for public amusement. And if you somehow found yourself in the wrong place at the wrong time, you could be forced to play a role in its violent theater. Gladiator games were the empire's most famous form of entertainment. Men, sometimes women, were trained like fighting animals, forced to battle for survival in front of crowds of 50,000 or more. Armed with swords, nets, or even tridents, they fought fellow gladiators, condemned criminals, and even wild beasts imported from the far corners of the empire. Lions from Africa, tigers from Persia, elephants from Indiarum, spent fortunes to make death a spectacle. The audience craved blood. A wounded gladiator lying on the sand would turn his eyes to the emperor's box, awaiting the signal. A thumbs up might grant mercy. A thumbs down could mean a sword thrust to the throat. Survival was rare, and even the strongest fighters eventually fell. But the gladiators were not the only ones to die in the arena. Ordinary criminals and prisoners of war were executed in staged reenactments of myths. A man might be dressed as Icarus only to be pushed from a height to his death. Another might play Prometheus, chained to a rock as a wild animal was set upon him. These were not performances with trickery. These were real deaths, designed to blend storytelling with slaughter. Some victims were unarmed, civilians sentenced for petty crimes. Theft, desertion, or simply angering the wrong official could mean being thrown to the beasts. The crowd laughed as lions tore men apart, treating human lives as disposable props. The games also served a political purpose. Emperors used them to distract the people from corruption, famine, or military defeat. Bred in circuses, as the saying went, give the masses free food and endless shows, and they would not rebel. For those watching, it was entertainment. For those in the arena, it was hell on earth. Even as a spectator, survival wasn't guaranteed. In the chaos of the crowd, riots sometimes broke out. Seats collapsed and stampedes crushed people. On one occasion in Pompeii, a brawl between rival fans escalated into deadly violence, with dozens killed in the stands. To survive a day in Rome, you would need to avoid the arena entirely. But with so much of the city's life centered on these games, that was almost impossible. Blood was everywhere in the sand, in the cheers, in the very identity of Rome itself. And yet Rome's cruelty wasn't limited to its arenas. Beyond the public spectacles, another danger lurked in the shadows' politics. Because in this empire, words could be deadlier than swords. Rome was a city where power brought wealth, glory, and admiration, but it also painted a target on your back. Political life in the empire was ruthless, and survival often depended not on strength, but on treachery. For an outsider, or even a common citizen, a single wrong word could drag you into the empire's deadly game of power. The Senate, once a place of debate and dignity, had long since become a stage for plots. Senators whispered alliances in dark corners, traded bribes, and sharpened daggers, sometimes literally. History remembers Julius Caesar most vividly, hero to the people. He walked confidently into the Senate in 44 BCE, unaware, perhaps resigned that dozens of his closest allies had conspired against him. Surrounded, he was stabbed 23 times, his body left on the floor he once ruled. But assassination was not reserved for great generals alone. Emperors themselves lived under constant threat. Caligula was cut down by his own guards. Domitian was murdered in his palace, betrayed by his servants. Even emperors who died naturally were often rumored to have been poisoned, their deaths whispered as convenient for rivals. Ordinary people, too, could be caught in this web. To speak ill of the emperor, even in jest, was considered treason. A drunken remark in a tavern could be reported, and before you knew it, you were dragged before officials, accused of conspiracy. Few survived such accusations. Torture was used freely, and confessions were forced, whether true or not. Wealth was no shield. The rich were often accused of treason simply so their fortunes could be seized. A senator with too much land, or a merchant with too much influence, might suddenly be accused of plotting against the emperor. Their property would vanish into the treasury, and their heads onto the executioner's block. Even friends could not be trusted. Informers were everywhere paid spies who listened at doors and reported to authorities. A neighbor might denounce you for personal gain. A slave could betray you under torture. A business partner might invent lies to eliminate competition. In Rome, suspicion was a weapon, and survival meant silence. The emperor himself was the most dangerous figure of all. His word was law, and his moods could kill. If he smiled, you might be honored. If he frowned, you might disappear. To live near the palace was to walk on a knife's edge, never knowing whether favor or fury awaited you. And yet politics was not the only danger lurking in Rome. While betrayal and treachery stalked the wealthy, the streets themselves held their own deadly traps. Because once the sun went down, another Rome emerged, one far more dangerous than the Senate chambers. As the sun sank below the horizon, Rome changed. By day, the city dazzled with temples, forums, and markets filled with chatter. But at night, the eternal city revealed its darker face. For a visitor or even a lifelong citizen, walking the streets after dark could mean courting death. There were no streetlights. Torches flickered only in a few wealthy districts, while most alleys lay in near total darkness. Shadows swallowed whole neighborhoods, and in those shadows waited thieves, drunkards, and gangs. They carried clubs and knives, preying on the vulnerable. A lone traveler with a coin purse could vanish into an alley and never return. Street gangs were not just groups of poor cutthroats. Some were tied to powerful politicians, hired to intimidate rivals or stir riots. In certain districts, they controlled entire blocks, demanding protection money from shopkeepers. Refuse them, and your shop could be burned, your family beaten. Even the city watchmen, poorly paid and poorly trained, often turned a blind eye or worse, joined in the crime. Fires were another terror. Roman buildings, especially insulated cheap apartment blocks, were made of wood, with floors stacked one atop the other. Oil lamps lit the rooms, kitchens burned with open flames, and careless cooking could spark a blaze. Once fire caught, it spread like a storm. Entire neighborhoods could be reduced to ash within hours. The most infamous case was in 64 CE, when fire raged for 6 days. Destroying much of Rome, ordinary people lost homes, families, and livelihoods overnight. Then there was the filth. Garbage piled in the streets, attracting rats and disease. Chamber pots were emptied out of windows, splashing onto anyone unlucky enough to pass below. Stench of human waste, mixed with rotting food and smoke from endless fires. For someone not used to it, breathing alone could feel like drowning. Night was also when slaves risked running away, criminals plotted, and desperate men prowled. But if caught, punishments were brutal: flogging, branding, mutilation, or crucifixion. Citizens often stayed home after sundown, bolting doors and praying their walls kept danger out. For those without shelter, the risks were even greater. Homeless Romans huddled in alleys, exposed not only to cold and hunger, but to predators who saw them as easy targets. Women faced even harsher dangers, as sexual violence ran unchecked. The city was alive with fear, chaos, and the constant risk of ruin. Survival required caution, cunning, and luck. And yet, even if you escaped the night unscathed, another challenge always awaited: the dawn. Because with morning came not peace, but the demands of survival in a city that never slept. But there was one last force more terrifying than thieves, fires, or even disease. Something that touched every Roman life, rich or poor, and it was found in the heart of the empire's power: religion and the gods. In ancient Rome, survival was never just about food, safety, or health. It was also about faith, because the gods ruled everything, from victory in war to the outcome of a fever. For a modern visitor, failure to respect these beliefs could be as deadly as a sword. Romans lived in constant fear of divine punishment. Every meal, every journey, and every battle began with offerings to the gods. Forget to honor them, and disaster was certain. To a Roman, sickness or misfortune was not random, it was a sign of divine anger. Priests and augurs, men who read the flight of birds or the entrails of animals, held real power. Their predictions could halt armies, overturn laws, or condemn individuals. Superstition dominated daily life. Spilled cup of wine, a crow flying overhead, or a sneeze at the wrong time could be read as an omen. To ignore these signs was unthinkable. For outsiders, even a careless laugh during a ritual might be seen as sacrilege. Punishment could be swift: exile, execution, or the wrath of a mob convinced you had cursed them all. Religious festivals brought both joy and danger. Crowds filled temples and streets, but the chaos often turned violent. During Saturnalia, slaves and masters reversed roles, gambling, drinking, and rioting without restraint. For those not prepared, the drunken disorder could mean robbery or worse. Worse still were the persecutions. When disaster struck, blame fell on those seen as offending the gods. Foreigners, minorities, or even early Christians were tortured and executed in public, accused of angering Rome's protectors. Fires, plagues, and famines were not viewed as natural disasters. They were proof that someone had failed in devotion. Even the emperor himself was tied to religion. Many demanded to be worshipped as gods in their lifetimes. Refusal to bow before them was treason. For a visitor from another time, hesitation to honor a living man as divine could mean instant death. And so, survival in Rome required more than strength or cunning. It required obedience to the gods, to the emperor, and to the city's brutal traditions. Every hour carried a new risk: disease, slavery, betrayal, fire, or divine wrath. To live a single day in ancient Rome was to gamble with fate itself. The people who endured it were toughened by struggle, hardened by fear, and shaped by a world where life was fragile, fleeting, and constantly at the mercy of forces beyond their control. For us today, the ruins of Rome inspire awe. But for those who lived within its walls, survival was the true triumph. And for any modern traveler, stepping into that world would almost certainly mean the same outcome: death before the first 24 hours were done.